The black belt asked a black janitor to spar with him for fun. What happened next silenced the entire martial arts gym. "Hey, you there cleaning? How about a quick demonstration?" shouted Derek Mitchell from the center of the mat, his black belt gleaming under the gym's fluorescent lights. "I bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, right?" James Washington paused mid-mop and lifted his eyes slowly. At 42, he had quietly worked at the gym for the past 3 weeks, always arriving when sessions had already concluded. But that Thursday, the advanced class lingered longer than usual. "I don't want to interrupt, Sensei," James said evenly, focusing again on the stubborn floor mark. "Just tidying up so everything's in order." Derek bellowed a dramatic laugh that reverberated through the room. "Look at this, everyone." The guy's too scared to even step onto the mat. A few of the 8 students chuckled awkwardly, clearly sensing tension. Derek had no idea James had spent the last 2 decades burying a truth so painful he'd nearly erased his own identity. It had been 20 years since he'd last stood in a cage. 20 years since he'd walked away from the sport after a night that shattered him. 20 years of silence, even from his daughter. "Come on, man," Derek goaded, stepping closer with that smug grin he used on rookies. "Just a small demonstration. I doubt you can even hold a guard." He gestured to his students. "Let's show them the difference between someone who trains and someone who scrubs floors." James felt an old fire ignite, a quiet storm stirring in his chest. When their eyes met, Derek instinctively stepped back, sensing something beneath the calm. "Just a friendly demo," Derek repeated, though his confidence had waned. "Nothing serious. Just to teach respect for the discipline." James placed his bucket aside and rose with a grace that betrayed his alleged inexperience. The air shifted. Students paused, sensing something was about to unfold. "All right," James said, his tone still and measured, like the quiet before thunder. "But afterward you're apologizing for making a joke out of their training." Derek forced a laugh, but this time it rang hollow. "Apologize? You'll be kissing the mat yourself." What no one there knew was that James Washington was once called James Silent Storm. Washington, a 5-time world MMA champion. He had vanished from the sport at its peak after a fateful incident that took his best friend's life. From that day he vowed never to fight again. But sometimes honor demands breaking sacred promises. If you're enjoying this story of overcoming adversity and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple moment of prejudice would turn into the most humiliating lesson of Derek Mitchell's life. Derek adjusted his black belt with a theatrical gesture, clearly savoring every second of attention. "Everyone gather around. You're about to see a practical demonstration of why there is a hierarchy in the world of martial arts." James watched as the 8 students formed a semicircle around the mat. Some seemed eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable. A young Asian woman with her hair tied back muttered something to a classmate next to her who just shook his head in disapproval. "Look, everyone," Derek continued, gesturing dramatically. "Here we have a perfect example of someone who never understood that there are appropriate places for certain types of people. Elite gyms are not for, well, you know." James felt that familiar twinge in his chest, the same one he had felt 20 years ago when he heard similar comments about fighters who didn't look like champions. The difference was that now at 42, he had learned to turn anger into fuel for something much more powerful than punches. "Sensei Derek," the young Asian woman interrupted timidly, "maybe we can continue our normal training. It's getting late. And, Sarah Chen, are you questioning my teaching methodology?" Derek cut her off sharply. "Sit down and watch. You'll learn more in the next 5 minutes than in a month of conventional training." James noticed how Derek used the girl's full name, a clear demonstration of authority. He also recognized the look of fear in her eyes, the same look he had seen in the mirror 2 decades ago when he woke up in a panic, remembering the accident that took the life of Tony Hammer Rodriguez, his best friend and training partner. Tony had died because of him. It was that simple. A series of punches that James had thrown with excessive force during sparring. Tony fell, hit his head on the floor in a strange way, and never woke up. The investigation concluded that it was an accident, but James knew the truth. He had lost control because of the pressure and the racist comments from the audience that night. "So, Janitor," Derek sneered, "how about showing my students how to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push?" A mop laughter echoed around the gym, but James remained motionless. His eyes closed briefly, and for a moment, he was back in that ring in Las Vegas, hearing the same kinds of comments that preceded the tragedy that changed his life forever. "What's the matter? Are you scared?" Derek insisted, now circling James like a predator. "Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost like you do with a squeegee all day?" That was when Derek made his first critical blunder. He reached out and gave James a light shove on the shoulder, an action that seemed playful but was laced with the smug confidence of someone unaccustomed to repercussions. James didn't budge. His stance was unshakable, as though rooted deep beneath the mat, and Derek felt like he'd just nudged an immovable slab of stone. The smug grin on his face wavered momentarily. "Fascinating," James murmured under his breath. "It's been a long time since someone dared to poke that bear." The tone wasn't angry or aggressive, it was unnervingly calm, the kind of serenity born only from enduring much darker moments and emerging with hard-earned wisdom. Derek, blind to the gravity in James' voice, amped up his mockery. Here, that folksy thinks it's fascinating. Let's teach him the difference between imagination and experience. But every insult and taunt was doing something Derek couldn't sit, was waking up a truth in James that slept for 20 long years. Not a thirst for vengeance, but the quiet reawakening of a warrior who had once walked into the ring with purpose. Sarah Chen shifted in place, increasingly uneasy. Something about James's measured breath, the nearly imperceptible coiling of his muscles, reminded her of the predatory grace in those nature documentaries she loved. The way a panther crouches before a strike. Last warning, Derek snapped, now clearly agitated by James' silence. Either accept the demonstration or I'll have security remove you. And yeah, guess what? That means you're out of a job, too. James opened his eyes, his gaze locking with Derek's. In that instant, the bravado evaporated from the instructor's face, replaced by the cold realization that he may have just stirred a force far beyond his comprehension. All right, James said at last, his voice a quiet storm brimming with command. But after this, you'll stand in front of your students and explain why you turned this dojo into a theater of mockery. Derek chuckled, but this time the laughter had lost its edge. Explain. You'll be explaining the floor pattern, with your back in a second. What neither of them realized was that for the last 2 decades, James hadn't just been hiding, he had been mastering emotional discipline, reshaping his past rage into something more calculated and formidable. Every insult was sharpening his composure. Fanning an icy fire that had broken champions beforehand was now about to face Derek. Adjusting his stance, Derek seemed to relish the hushed anticipation surrounding the gym. His 8 students now formed a circle around the mat, tension on every face. Some appeared excited, others shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what they were witnessing. Today, you're all getting a lesson worth more than half a year of training, Derek proclaimed, spreading his arms wide like a ringmaster. This is what separates lifelong martial artists from people who just wipe sweat off the floor. James remained statuesque in the center, but something in his body language changed. His breathing deepened, his eyelids lowered. Mentally, he was no longer in Colorado. He was back inside the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas 22 years ago, moments before his world-titled bout with Victor the Demolition Man. Look at that skinny black guy, someone had yelled from the audience back then. Bet he can't even go 3 rounds. James had won via TKO in the second, but the pressure of that night had cracked something in him. Days later, during an intense sparring session, that same pressure caused a lapse in control that took Tony Rodriguez's life. So, Janitor, Derek mocked again, stalking around James like a lion sizing up prey. Why don't you show my students the wrong way to guard? Or is that to advance for a mop expert? At that point, Sarah Chen could no longer stay silent. The 22-year-old jiu-jitsu purple belt and graduate student in sports psychology had spent years compiling case studies on bias in athletics. What she saw now felt like a goldmine for her thesis. It also stirred something deeper. Sensei Derek, she said firmly, stepping forward. May I ask a question? Why do you believe it's necessary to degrade someone just doing their job? The silence that followed landed like a punch to the chest. Derek turned to face her, his eyes narrowing, caught off guard and annoyed. Excuse me, Sarah, but who exactly is teaching this class? You are, she replied, steady and composed. But that doesn't mean racial mockery should be disguised as martial instruction. Murmurs moved through the students. Some exchanged wary glances. No one had ever stood up to Derek like this before. His cheeks darkened with a flush of fury and embarrassment. Racial Derek laughed stiffly. This isn't about race, it's about knowing your role and respecting the mat. James opened his eyes slowly. There was a resonance in Sarah's words, a courage that reminded him of his younger sister Kesha. She had once stood just as bravely in the face of injustice. She had never learned how to stay quiet. Kesha had died at 17, the victim of a stray bullet during a police confrontation in her neighborhood. James was competing in Japan when he received the news. Another person he loved lost while he pursued glory in distant rings. Another reason to abandon everything and disappear into the simplicity of an anonymous life. Sarah, Derek said in a voice that was dangerously restrained. If my methods don't sit right with you, maybe a different gym would be better suited for someone with your values. His words lingered like a poisonous fog. Sarah's spine stiffened at the threat, but she refused to yield. I've paid my tuition, Sensei, and I believe this should be a place of respect, not ridicule. At that moment, James did the unthinkable. He smiled. But it wasn't a smile born of fear or submission. It was a slow, resolute smile, like a man rediscovering a truth buried under decades of regret. For 20 years, he had carried the burden of 2 lives shattered by his connection to the ring. And now, watching a young woman stand firm in defense of what he himself had abandoned, James Washington began to reclaim the man he once was. Derek, James said at last, his words calm but commanding enough to silence the room. She's absolutely right. This isn't about discipline or form. It's about you using this place to elevate your ego by tearing down others. Derek turned abruptly, his cheeks flushed with rage. Who do you think you are to lecture me on martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is. James stepped forward, and with that small movement, everything shifted. His shoulders squared, his center of gravity dropped subtly, his feet slid into position with instinctive precision. To any trained eye, it was unmistakable. Flawless fighting. A stance, actually, James said evenly. I know exactly what a dojo is, and this stopped being one the moment you turned it into a stage for your pride. A shiver ran through Derek's body. It wasn't just the stance, it was the way James carried himself now, like the room belonged to him, a quiet authority that needed no volume. But Derek's bruised ego refused to yield. Enough talking, he barked, falling into his signature pose. You want respect, I'll make you earn it. Sarah's concern grew, but so did her curiosity. She had spent years reviewing martial arts footage for her graduate work, yet something in James's presence now struck her as different. His movements were minimal, his energy perfectly contained, his presence radiating quiet might. James closed his eyes and surrendered to the discipline carved into him through 2 decades of relentless training. Each stance, each breath, each memory of battle coalesced within him. And when he opened his eyes again, Derek Mitchell was no longer looking at a janitor. He was standing face to face with Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world MMA champion. One last chance, James said softly, his voice imbued with firm kindness. Apologize to her, to your students, and restore this space to what it's meant to be. Derek laughed, but his voice cracked under the tension. Apologize. You'll be apologizing to the mat after I put you on it. What Derek failed to see was that James had already mapped every flaw in his fighting style. The raised guard that neglected body protection, the consistent backpedaling lead by his right foot, the micro twitches in his shoulders that made each strike obvious. Time hadn't dulled. James' insight had sharpened it, Sarah observed, as some students began stepping back instinctively, sensing something primal in the air. The room felt heavy, as if static electricity crackled invisibly around them. The shift was intangible, yet unmistakable. Then, just as the laughter from Derek's last barb faded, something unspoken transformed in James's demeanor. It wasn't fury, it wasn't vengeance. It was the resolve of a man who had found something worth breaking a sacred silence for. A few students began to realize that they weren't watching just another sparring match, they were on the brink of witnessing something remarkable. Derek settled into his favorite pose, the one he'd used to intimidate novices for years. Feet square, hands clenched near his chest, leaning slightly forward, a textbook stance, honed in sterile training halls against rehearsed opponents. James didn't move. He simply watched, his eyes gliding over Derek's frame like a scanner. He took in every posture, cut the exposed ribs beneath the lifted elbows, the shaky stance that betrayed overconfidence, the tight shoulders betraying premature intention. Still, Derek bounced on the balls of his feet. What's the holdup? Still posing like a lamppost, he taunted. Then James moved. No flourish, no theatrics, just a seamless shift in footing, a subtle dip in posture, his frame lowering and aligning with mechanical elegance. But to the trained observer, it was like witnessing the ignition of a storm. Sarah Chen felt goosebumps crawl along her arms. In 2 years of biomechanical research, she had studied the best athletes in the sport. What James had just demonstrated was the elusive moment when a seasoned warrior transitions into combat mode, not with noise, but with chilling precision. Interesting, Derek muttered, his bravado faltering. There was something about the way James occupied the space now that awakened all of his self-preservation instincts. James took a step forward, and Derek instinctively backed away. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive that several students noticed. A black belt backing away from a janitor. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Problem? James asked quietly, his voice calm yet commanding, and the entire gym fell into a hushed stillness. Derek's face flushed crimson. His authority was unraveling in front of his pupils. His pride wouldn't let him retreat, even as instinct screamed that he should. No problem, Derek answered with a forced grin. Just appreciating your stance. He tried to recover with a jab. What, did you pick that up on YouTube? But no one laughed. The air was thick, charged with something electric and unspoken. Actually, James replied evenly, I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gym. You might have heard of it. Derek squinted, the name ringing. A distant bell. He couldn't quite place Las Vegas. What, one of those weekend warrior boot camps? Meanwhile, Sarah Chen discreetly retrieved her phone and typed Las Vegas National Gym Martial Arts into a search bar. Her eyes widened. As the results loaded, it wasn't just a training center, it was the birthplace of legends. For 30 years it had produced the world's top-tier MMA champions. Derek, James continued, voice steady and cool, this is your final opportunity. Apologize to Sarah for trying to silence her. Apologize to your students for turning this dojo into a circus. And above all, apologize to yourself for becoming what martial arts were meant to protect you from becoming. His words hung in the air like dust caught in a beam of sunlight. Derek had a choice to humble himself, step back, and preserve what remained of his standing. But pride blinds, and he attacked. Derek's first jab was flawless, quick, precise, textbook form, a punch that had stunned opponents for years. But James wasn't like anyone Derek had ever faced. Before Derek's fist had fully extended, James had shifted with surreal smoothness. The punch cut through empty space. It was like trying to strike a shadow. Derek stumbled, briefly unbalanced. "Not bad," James murmured, now perfectly aligned. Beside him, good mechanics, decent speed, but you gave it away with your shoulder tension. Derek turned in a rush, scanning for him. How had he moved so fast? "Beginner's luck," he mumbled, trying to reassure himself. The second wave came, jab cross, hook, a trusted trio that Derek had used to finish more than a few bouts. But once again, James was simply ... gone. Sarah, this time, could follow the pattern. James ducked the jab with a slight dip. The straight passed inches overhead as he leaned back just enough. The hook sliced through air when he shifted his weight backward with surgical precision. "Nice rhythm," James commented gently, still breathing as calmly as if on a stroll. But that left side, completely unprotected. Derek was sweating now, frustration mounting. He had thrown thousands of punches in his life, and here, he hadn't connected once. "Stop dancing and fight," he barked, launching into a furious barrage. That's when James decided enough was enough. Derek's flurry punches a kick. Another punch met nothing but air again. But now, when Derek reset, James was suddenly much closer. "How?" Derek gasped, realizing too late he'd lost control of the range. "Derek," James said, softly, only a breath away, "do you know the difference between someone who trains in dojos and someone who fought for survival in rings around the world?" Before Derek could respond, James did something no one expected. With no wind-up, no aggression, he calmly extended his arm and placed the flat of his palm against Derek's chest, and pushed, or so it seemed. Derek didn't stumble. He soared. Like a rag doll flung by invisible forces, he left the ground, flew back nearly 2 meters, and crashed onto the mat with a thud that echoed off every wall. Time froze. No one moved. Derek lay on his back, blinking up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. There was no pain. Only the overwhelming realization that he had just encountered a level of control he hadn't known was possible. That Derek croaked, attempting to sit up. "That's not real." Sarah Chen stood paralyzed. In all her years of martial arts study, she had never seen anything so effortlessly devastating. Devastating display of power. There was no brutality, no anger, just the clinical application of a technique she had only seen in legends. "Actually," James said gently, extending a hand toward Derek, "it's basic once you understand how timing, leverage, and energy transfer work together. Things I learned over 2 decades in the professional circuit." Derek didn't take the offer. He stood on his own, legs trembling beneath him. 22 years of what?" he asked, voice shaky. Sarah, still holding her phone, spoke before anyone else could. "You don't understand who he really is, do you?" All eyes turned to her as she read from the glowing screen. It was filled with articles, archived footage, and accolades. "James Washington," she began, her tone reverent, "also known as Silent Storm, 5-time MMA world champion, one of the sport's greatest tacticians, retired undefeated after 22 years, following an incident that claimed the life of his training partner." The revelation dropped like a hammer. Derek's face drained of color. He had unknowingly mocked and challenged a man worshipped in the martial arts world. A legend in hiding. He stammered. 5-time champion." James offered a small nod. "I stepped away at 29. Since then I've worked humble jobs, cleaning, repairs, maintenance, quiet work, no fanfare, no pressure, just peace." The shift in Derek's demeanor was immediate and jarring. The smugness dissolved. In its place stood a man deeply ashamed. I didn't know," he whispered. If you had," James interjected softly, "would you have treated me better? Or would you have still mocked the next janitor who didn't have a resume to protect him?" The word struck deeper than any strike ever could. Derek realized the truth. This wasn't about James' identity. It was about the mentality that judged others by their job titles. Sarah stepped forward, voice unwavering. "Sensei. Derek, I've trained here for 2 years because I respected your knowledge, but today I didn't witness education. I saw humiliation, disguised as teaching." Quiet voices echoed her sentiment. The energy in the gym had changed. Now, James' identity illuminated everything they had overlooked. "James," Derek said after a pause, his tone stripped of ego, "I owe you, Sarah, and everyone here a sincere apology. My actions were inexcusable." James accepted it, with the same grace that had defined his every move. "Thank you, Derek, but apologizing is just the first step. What truly matters is what you choose to become moving forward." Derek turned, scanning the room. The eyes that once admired him now watched with quiet disappointment. "I'll do better," he said. "I have to. It won't be easy, but I'll earn back their respect." Then Sarah surprised everyone. "Mr. Washington, would you consider becoming an instructor here? We'd benefit far more from someone who teaches with humility and understands the truth." weight of strength. James smiled genuinely, openly, the first real one they'd seen from him. Maybe, but not to teach how to fight. I'd rather show people something greater, that real strength isn't in fists or belts. It's in how we carry ourselves. Derek now quiet internalized the final painful truth. One night had reshaped his entire worldview. The question remained, would the lesson endure, or would more growth be required for genuine redemption? 3 months later, the gym had been completely transformed. James Washington was no longer just the janitor. Sarah Chen had convinced the gym owner to hire him as an instructor specializing in advanced techniques and martial arts philosophy. Derek Mitchell lost half of his students in the first week after the incident. The video Sarah had discreetly recorded spread across social media, showing a black belt being humiliated by a mere janitor. His reputation in the martial arts community was ruined. "Sensei James," Sarah said after a class on respect and humility, "thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized." James smiled, organizing the equipment. "The best lesson I can teach is simple. Never judge someone by their profession or appearance. Everyone carries stories that can surprise us." Derek continued teaching at a smaller gym, but now with a humility forced by public shame. He had learned the hard way that arrogance comes at a price. Sometimes justice comes quietly, like a storm that transforms everything without making a sound. James proved that true revenge is not destroying your opponent, but showing that greatness comes from character, not titles. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.